Occasionally, we like to recount some stories of some business experiences from the past. And this is going back many, many years into the 1980s. There was a business that we managed and had some oversight of that had a warehouse. And this warehouse was in kind of a rough part of town. And occasionally on the weekends, the warehouse would be broken into and people would steal things. And they weren't really high value items. They were kind of lower value industrial things in this warehouse. But the owner of the business did not want these things being stolen. So one of the solutions was there was a security guard who was a really rough and tough former military guy. And he was kind of a little bit fringe society kind of guy. He really didn't live in a nice place, and he wasn't a kind of polished human being. Nice enough guy, but he was a rough guy. And he would patrol this warehouse at night, kind of like a security guard. Well, this was in a northern part of the country, and in the winter, it was cold, and this warehouse was not heated. It was freezing cold in this warehouse. And this security guard, his name was Charlie, Charlie would sleep on the concrete floor in the warehouse. And to him, it was no big deal. That was like his life. He was used to very austere, rough environments. So at some point, the owner felt bad for poor Charlie sleeping in this warehouse and said, look, don't worry. You don't have to sleep in the warehouse. We'll come up with something else. And Charlie was a little disappointed because he liked doing this. But the owner of the business did not think that he wanted to be there over the weekend at night in the freezing cold. So the owner of the business decided to hire patrol dogs, and he found this guy. The guy's name was Stan, and Stan was another character. He was all scarred up from being burned. He had third-degree burns over a lot of his body as a young kid. He was kidnapped and forced into a barn. The barn caught on fire. That was the story he told. And he was severely injured, and he was disfigured. But Stan, now what he did was he trained attack dogs and guard dogs for a living. That was his job. So Stan was hired to provide 2 security dogs that would patrol this warehouse at night and on weekends. And what would happen is, at the end of the day, when this company shut down, Stan would show up at the warehouse, bring his dogs out of his car, open the door, put them in, lock the door, and everybody would leave. No one was going near these dogs. These dogs were savage, Rottweiler, mean, slobbering, big teeth, just savage dogs. Nobody wanted to be around him, including me. And usually myself or somebody else was one of the last people to leave, so we'd be there waiting for Stan. He would show up. We'd just crack the door open. He'd put the dogs in, lock the door, and that would be the end of it. And then the next morning, we'd get there. We wouldn't go inside until Stan showed up. We unlocked the door. Usually by then the dogs would be at the door, chomping, slobbering at the door when they heard us in the parking lot. And Stan would just come up, grab their collars, and put them in his truck and leave. So we showed up one morning. It may have been a Monday after a weekend. And I went to the door and there were no dogs. So I went and I peeked in the door. I didn't see any dogs. Knocked on the door. Yelled. Usually by then the dogs would be practically diving through the glass trying to get me. And there was no dogs. So finally, Stan showed up. He said, where are the dogs? I don't know. He goes, well, open the door and go in there with me. No, I'm not going in there. These dogs are crazy. So he said, well, we got to get the dogs. So I said, I'll unlock the door. You have to go in there and get them. He said, but I don't know my way around. It's dark and you have to show me around. So one of the guys that worked there at this warehouse had a gun, and he carried a gun with him legally as part of his everyday life. So he said, well, we'll all go in, but Bob, he's going first with the gun. These dogs come. Stan, I don't know what to tell you, but I'm not going to get eaten by a dog. So we walked through the warehouse. We had flashlights, couldn't find the dogs, didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. And went upstairs. The warehouse had 3 or 4 levels. We finally went down into the basement of this warehouse, and there's a lot of industrial machinery down there. Finally, we come across, halfway down the row, here's the 2 dogs with ropes tied to their collars. They were sitting on the floor, tied to a big piece of machinery, and had a little note tied to one of the ropes that said, your dogs are pansies, love Charlie. So what had happened was Charlie had been offended by us having dogs in this warehouse, had come to the business, let himself in, had defeated the dogs, tied them up, and left to send us a message that he wanted his job back. So, make a long story short, Stan was very, very embarrassed. He took his dogs and left. We never saw him again. Talked to Charlie and said, Charlie, what happened with these dogs? How did you do it? He goes, they were just like anybody else. I just punched them in the face, knocked them out, and I tied them up. So, not that any of this is good. You don't want to be abusing dogs. You don't want to be, being loose and with guns or anything else. But this was a different, time of life, and a lot of things are happening. And that was one of these interesting stories that happened in life that, you wouldn't do that again. And I probably wouldn't have Charlie manning a warehouse again. I probably wouldn't have these dogs again. But it was something that was an interesting story that we tell to people about something in the past that was kind of like a show and tell type scenario of things that happen in business that you don't expect.